Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much, the organisers, for inviting me along. Thank you, Eddie. I'm very jealous of Eddie's finds. I've spent 3 years digging in Glencoe, found nothing like that. So cracking to see, excellent stuff. What I want to do today is to show you some of our work. I'm going back to the tartan and the shortbread stuff. So we're going for whisky, our other national icon. Scotland is obviously well known for whisky, better than Ireland, obviously. It's a huge commercial industry, but how did it get that way? There are over 130 malt and grain distilleries across the country, and of course, it's one of our most productive exports. But there's a lot of romance and tradition spoken around whisky making. Whisky making is largely done initially for people's own consumption, to turn excess farm produce, barley, into something you can take to market and you can sell and you can make money on it. As soon as you can make money on it, the government taxes it. You all know that. It's driven underground. Basically, it becomes illegal to do it in large quantities and to transport it down to the south of Scotland. So the excisemen are there to capture the illicit smugglers, the guys who are taking it from the distilleries or the illicit stills down to the south. There are a whole range of legal requirements around it, and the history goes up and down. It really relates to how much the government needs money a lot of the time. So Oliver Cromwell in the 17th century slaps tax on it. But when we think about the sort of views of illicit whisky making and small scale, these are the sort of romantic images that we think of. David Wilkie's picture of the smuggler checking out the quality of his whisky, probably in a distillery somewhere near Loch Gilphead in Argyll, I think. And then the other one, the raggedy guy on the right with the big knife, Dirk, who's fighting the exciseman, is all about the wily native, I suppose, very much native in that case, having dropped his small keg there and trying to fend off the exciseman. And all these stories, there's lots of stories across the country that relate to that side of things. But what is whisky making? You all know it, so I won't going to go into a lot of detail. Basically, you take barley, you steep it until it becomes malt. So it starts to sprout. You stop that process and you turn the sugars into beer, basically. So you heat it to dry the malting process. You grind it down, soak it in hot water and to turn it into a small beer. And then you put it through the distillery process, through the wash still, and then the spirit still, where it then goes into the maturation process. That's the industrial scale of whisky making. And it doesn't matter what scale you do it at. It can be done all the way from a small pot still up to a large grain still as we see them today. So barley is taken, it's soaked, it can be soaked, it doesn't have to be in a steep, a distillery. You can stick a sack of grain in a burn and put it under a rock and it will sprout. You dry it once it's sprouted. So you have a kiln, and we've all seen lots of grain drying kilns across the country. We've got one or two that are associated very closely with illicit whisky stills. You grind it, don't need a big mill. You could have it do it in a hand mill if you want. That's one from Glencoe. And then, of course, once you're making a mash, you need containers. So you need to put it into barrels. Barrels can be big barrels, barrels can be small barrels. You can take your pick, and you can use those barrels for all the different processes of whisky making. What you really need is a copper pot still, and that's the expensive part. That's the part you don't want the exciseman to get his hands on because you've invested or your community has invested in buying it, and that's the small one from Glenlivet. You need a copper worm to distill the spirit as it comes out of the still, so as it cools down at different temperatures, different alcohol contents will be given off. Once again, it's stored, and then it goes through the system again, and you then store it and take it off to market. And that's the sort of process. It doesn't matter if it's big scale, industrial, or small scale, a small pot still. So when we're talking about illicit whisky making, we're talking about bothies. We're talking about hidden places in the countryside, usually beside the burn. Usually, if you think of making a den as a kid, I think you all made dens as a kid, hiding things. Basically, you have branches, you cover it in heather and thatch and all that sort of thing. Make sure that you can't see it, because that's what you're doing. You're hiding the process because you're going to be making whiskey for a week. So you don't want to be found out when you're making it. So that's the sort of impression of a bothy little stone wall, plinth or fire, copper pot still, and some various containers. Now, there's lots of work being done. We're not the only people doing work into illicit whisky work. There's plenty of books that you can read, and you can see them up there. Gavin Smith's one, The Secret Stills a Cracker. And of course, there's lots of archaeological work been going on. Derek Pratt's been doing his PhD work over the last few years. Black Middens was excavated, small farm scale distillery. Many of the volunteer groups have been doing lots of really good survey work. So Mera Marshall's work in Strathconan and the Peebles Archaeology did an excavation of one just to the south of Peebles itself. And of course, on the larger scale, Gard did an excavation of a distillery site, a 19th century distillery site in Annan. Now, the National Trust for Scotland, who I work for, we have a connection to whisky at many of our properties. We looked through our collections to see what that might be. We've got some really nice ones. We've got a little whisky still here from Cortachy in Angus that's on display in House of Dun. We've got other little barrels like this one here for moving things around. This is my favourite. This is a bottle of King's Ransom from the SS Politician, which is in Whisky Galore, which is in Canna House, which was given to John Lorne Campbell and Margaret Fay Shaw by the man who wrote Whisky Galore, and I keep forgetting his name. What's the man who? Compton Mackenzie. And then this was a good one for us because this is the Chivas Brothers Scots Whisky merchant in Aberdeen, and our partner for this project is the Glenlivet, and they are part of the Chivas Brothers group. So we showed them that one just to get them convinced. Now, and as long as we've got lots and lots of artifactual evidence, but we also had, and we knew from the range of the Trust's property portfolio, having lots of upland landscapes, that we had about 30 known illicit whisky bothies on our ground, 9 at Torridon, about 9 or 8 at Mar Lodge, which were surveyed by the Royal Commission back in the 90s, and one of the first drawn surveys I saw of illicit whisky bothy. So we wanted to get a better understanding of what that was. We came to an agreement with the Glenlivet to fund us to look into the history of and archaeology of whisky making. So we'd known quite a bit about these sort of sites over the years, and we had previously done bits of excavation. This is one at Ben Lomond, above our desk, above Rower Denon. If you've been to the youth hostel there, there's a waterfall that comes right down the gully, Spooked Ban, and this little terrace, just a bit of dry stone walling, sits right beside the burn in a very good location, hidden away. You'd have to be right in it to see it. You couldn't see it from above, but it's also got some telltale signs around it, good access to water, a lot of juniper growing in there as well, some of which may be good for smokeless fuel, but also may have been used as a flavouring for whisky, because we tend to think of whisky as being the whisky that we know, but in fact it was probably pretty rough spirit and the best of the sense of the word, and probably needed flavouring in some way. What I want to do, I'm not going to go through all of the sites that we've done. You'll be glad to hear, because we've done quite a few of them now, but I'm going to focus on 2 illicit whisky bothies, and then we're going to look at Glenlivet distillery itself. So we're going to focus first of all on our estate at Torridon, and then we're going to look at one on Ben Lomond. Torridon's a great site to look at. Inner and outer Loch Torridon here, we know that there's a cluster of illicit whisky bothies at the west end and also at the east end as you're going along Glen Torridon towards Kinloch U. There is actually now a set of structures in this area too. The reason we chose Torridon as a place was because actually there's a really good bit of local history been done by Murdoch MacDonald, where this wonderful little booklet, The Battle of the Black Pot. If you're up there in Torridon shop, you can get it. I don't know if you can get it anywhere else, but it's cracking. And you can see how good it is because it's been in my bag quite a lot, and it's got quite muddy as we went traipsing around the hill, because the only guide to the exact location of this site here was the photograph on the front, because he didn't say exactly where it was. So we ended up walking across the hillsides until we found the bit of stone that looked the same. And lo and behold, here is the bothy hidden. Here's Daniel, my colleague down there. So The good thing about it is there's lots of documentary sources. So we've done the standard archaeological things. We've been out, we've drawn things, we've measured things, we've plotted things, I've done graphs. We've excavated and we've produced these plans. And these are sort of standard, if you know about illicit whisky bothies, the sort of standard things, D-shaped little buildings tucked against upright wall faces or bedrock outcrops, usually beside a burn with water flowing either through the structure or very close to the structure where it could be tapped off. And in one case, we had a very close by, 100 meters away, a grain drying malting kiln in close proximity to the excavated sites. The good thing about Murdo's work is that he describes in detail in the 1880s, there's lots of written evidence about illicit whisky making, and it doesn't come from the illicit whisky makers because they don't write things down because they don't want to get caught. It comes from the excisemen and the prosecution. And this was one site that intrigued us because we wanted to find out, because he describes it in great detail, so not about the discovery by the excisemen of an illicit whisky bothy, and it also describes this type of things that were in it, and there's a hell of a lot in it. So it says here, not more than 30 minutes had elapsed since the time the officer had left the place, but in the interval, the smugglers had decamped, taking with them the still's head, and the worm, the expensive bits. The place, however, contained whole of the brewing utensils and material in course of manufacture, washback containing a quantity of wash, 60 gallons, containing a quantity of low wines, a low wine receiver, 2 worm tubs, a brewing tub, a wash charger, a tin of yeast, 5-gallon flask, a tin can, and there were also an old-fashioned lamp, 2 creels, a kitchen pot, teapot, a number of bottles, a spade, 4 empty sacks, a horn drinking cup, several articles of clothing, and quantity of provisions such as oatmeal, oatcake, potatoes, herring, and salt. The whole material was destroyed, and the plant consigned to the flames. So there you go. And what was really nice about this site is it was so well concealed here. It described it that we didn't know exactly where it was. We knew where the description said it would be, and we went looking for it. The place was so well concealed at the base of a rock in a natural hollow that after, although a few hours previously, party of the 3 had passed quite close to it, nothing amiss was suspected. The supply of water was, however, very scarce, so don't just follow the burns. And it was discharged from worm tub. It was carefully collected in an artificial pond, but it was allowed to cool, and again to do duty in the worm tub. I love that. And I quite like the bit at the bottom that says, the meal of potatoes and herrings, which the smugglers had prepared, was left untouched and was quite hot when the officers came to the place, which I quite like. It's a bit Marie Celeste. So that's the site. We found it at Laggy Doo, tucked in against the bedrock, and we excavated the interior. All that wonderful description of things that was found in it, and we found 1 bottle out of the lot. So it obviously got thoroughly destroyed, and I think a fire must have been held somewhere else outside. But we did find the drains for tapping the water back from the still, and we did lots and lots of sampling of the material. In contrast to that, where we've got good documentary sources, I wanted to touch on this site at Ben Lomond, Corrie Corach, just below the main path up to the summit. All it showed on the surface was these 3 stones in a line and a slight gully at the back here, and we thought this could be an illicit whisky bothy because there's a stream here. We spent a very midgy week excavating in the interior of this, and actually found, in fact, that wall was in fact the back wall and not the front wall of an illicit whisky bothy. And in the interior, we recovered the remains of fire grates, so iron fire grates like this, for holding coals underneath a pot still, a patch, a lead patch for a barrel, for stopping a leaking barrel coming apart, and a series of timber remains, prop for a roof, basically for holding up the roof, and 4 barrel staves, including a couple of bits from the top of a barrel and the bits with the cruising in it at the base. So a bucket or a barrel in its own right. And I think this is probably the remains of the worm tub, given its location on the uphill side of where the fire was here. So on that basis, I drew a reconstruction in a very sort of time team-esque type fashion. So we've got the wall, we've got these are the fire grates here, with the bigger grate being the support for the copper still, which we didn't find. And the barrels would have sat in here with the worm going through and the patch from the barrel. Needless to say, we haven't found huge amounts of material culture. We've excavated about 6 of these sites, and that's probably the most that we've recovered was from Ben Lomond. But what I wanted to do now was to show the exact opposite. This is the Glenlivet original distillery site. If you go to the original distillery now, it's down the hill. But in 1824, George Smith got a license to produce legal distillery, distilled whiskey. He was an illegal distiller initially for the Glenlivet in that area, and it was probably in his farm. And this is a survey, in fact, that I did back in 1994 when I worked for the CFA at Edinburgh University of that original distillery site. Now, there's not much left on the ground. If you go through the old maps, you see back in the 1870s, there was a couple of buildings, but even I knew there was a distillery here because it says on the map, Old Distillery. It has a chimney and 2 dams, which is something you see a lot in distillery setups. But by the 1890s, you can see more of the buildings have disappeared. And by the time you get to the current Ordnance Survey map, there's nothing left. And even this old chimney, which we were able to get photographs of, had completely disappeared. So nothing surviving on the ground to mark the site. But we knew from estate maps that it was in fact a farm, a courtyard farm, with 2, as we say, with 2 dams on either side of it. Courtyard here and the farmhouse here, and this was his distillery. Effectively, he was an improving farmer. He was encouraged, he was making whiskey probably in his byre or barn, but he's given a grant and a license from the Duke of Gordon to turn legit and start making larger quantities of whiskey. So he starts making 50 gallons a week. By 1828, he's making 100 gallons a week, and by the 1830s, are up to 200 gallons a week. So gradually getting bigger and bigger. So our excavations here have shown the outline of the distillery, and we were very fortunate because in the first year we hit the still house straight on the button. So we've got the remains of 3 fire pits underneath what would be probably the boiler, the wash still, and the boiler, the wash still, and the spirit still. And what we have out here are a series of receivers for whiskey and what's called the underback. This is where the mash tun is allowed to cool, drains into here. It's not alcohol yet. It's then transferred, pumped down into here, where the wash tubs and washbacks are, where it's fermented into beer before going back into the stills. So these things here are actually, we know that these are when it's been made into whiskey or distilled, because they've got, the pots would have sat on a framework of timbers, which allowed the excisemen to look underneath to inspect that there was no tapping in illegally or withdrawing any of the whiskey off of these, so they could inspect underneath the receivers. And that's what we're looking at. This is the 1920s view of the current distillery, and you've got to remember that we are digging this sort of level down here. You know, in usual archaeological fashion, we're missing all the stuff up above. And of course, the place was just deliberately dismantled in 1859 when they moved down the hill. Moving down the hill allows them to get more access for more water, which means they can increase their production into hundreds and thousands of gallons a week. So that's an overview of the site, which is showing rather nicely here. We're in the corner of the farm, and the courtyard is in this area up here, the doorway through. There would have been a sign over the doorway that said Glenlivet Distillery and the license number. And then here would have been a guy shoveling coal in underneath as I say, the water boiler, and then the 2 stills before it goes into the receivers at that end there. So really nice industrial archaeology, and that's a plan of it as we've drawn up, showing again the courtyard up the top here and the corner building. What we're missing probably out here is the grain drying kiln, which was demolished or taken down piece by piece and move down the hill. So it's looking something like this. This is an illustration of the Isla distillery, and what we have here, sitting peacefully in the corner, reading his paper, is the exciseman. No longer does he have to run across the hillside chasing smugglers. He basically just has a lock and key that keeps the spirits safe from the distillery, the stills, before it goes into the receivers there. So he's the man that keeps a tab on everything. I showed you the iron fire grate from Ben Lomond. This is a larger version of it, doing exactly the same process, holding up a fire, probably coal fire in this case, heating the larger pot stills at the industrial scale distillery. We've excavated with volunteers and locals, and had the local primary schools out helping us over the last 3 years, and we'll be going back finally in this summer. And we've had some great artifacts, including some leather boots, lots of ironwork, some copper pipes and things, whistle here, and a silver coin there. And this was our star find, found quite close to the start of our excavation. One of our volunteers found it. It's a brass plaque here, and it says Gottlieb Patent. And we did thorough, in-depth research on this by going online and going straight onto Google. And this came up on eBay. And what we have here is the brass plaque from an 1829 exciseman's padlock. It's a patent for the exciseman. And what you could do is you could lock the padlock, put a bit of paper in underneath this central plate, write on it, and make sure nobody tampered with it. So probably our single star find from the whole excavation. But we've got lots of other nice bits. We've got copper pipes and offcuts. We've got these are barrel bungs, basically cork oak. We have a valve here for a lot of pumping of stuff. We've got the remains of a pump. This one's so good that the slide has actually gone off the screen, and there's actually a brick kiln, an air brick from a kiln in the furnace. And then this is another lead patch for a whiskey barrel. So there's a bit of similarities between the scale and the production of whiskey, just from the illicit side of things through to the industrial side. And our final nice bits, we've got usual clay tobacco pipes, great for dating. This is a coin of George III. George III's reign stops in 1820. Whiskey production starts here in 1824. I wonder if this is money that was paid to George Smith for his illegal whiskey before it goes legit. And this is an inscribed piece of glass, and I can't see what it says, but it looks like a G there. And I don't know whether it's a George or a Glenlivet, but we could argue about that. And finally, the contrast between the documentary side of things on this type of site, the industrial site, is that you've got really good documentary records going with who worked there and what they were doing, right down to the names of the people and the distillery servants and that side of things, which we don't have for the illicit side of things. So, pioneering spirit, as I say, project in partnership between the Glenlivet and the National Trust for Scotland. We've been doing a lot of work across the last few years. It's been a wonderful project. It's kept us going through initially through lockdown and things like that, which was great. Obviously, this kept us going as well. But it's been a really useful way to look into trust landscapes. We've now done about 4 or 6 digs altogether on bothies, 1 on a kiln, and we're going to be doing another 2 excavations this year. And finally, just to say slange and cheers to the Glenlivet for their support, and to the National Trust for Scotland for letting us continue this work, and to all our staff and volunteers and members, and local volunteers and members of the public who've come and helped us. So thank you very much.